Welcome to SpyHards podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the NOC List. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam, the provocateur.
And Cam, we have a very special guest joining us this week.
Yes, we do, for sure. The perfect person to wrap up the Harry Palmer series.
The owner and creator of the Deighton Dossier website, which I've actually referenced when I'm doing my research for these films in the past. It is none other than Rob Mallows. Rob, welcome aboard.
Good evening, gentlemen. Nice to be on board.
See, the accent is already better than mine. He's bringing up the class of the joint. He's already more eloquent. Damn, I thought I was the good British sounding guy on here.
Well, whatever accent aside, it's great to be on your podcast and following in footsteps of other interesting discussions on both Deighton and other spy stuff. Particularly, I heard Shane Whaley a couple of weeks ago, who I know from the SpyHards podcast. So yeah, looking forward to a good discussion.
I feel like the Harry Palmer films have really pushed us to book really strong guests because Harry Palmer is such a acquired taste, and in North America where I am, not very well known at all. And so it's actually led to some really interesting people coming on to talk about a franchise that most of my entire life I had no idea even existed.
Yeah, I put it frankly, he's very British, and I guess he lacks a certain degree of the panache, perhaps, that a James Bond or a Jason Bourne has for an international audience. But they're more home. They have a certain charm, I think. Let's put it that way. All three movies and the other two as well. We're going to talk about later. But yeah, I like them. I like the stuff that Len Deighton writes. I like James Bond as well. I like a lot of spy fiction. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear your reactions as well.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious. You run the Deighton Dossier blog, where you really give the history of Len Deighton, the author, the creator of Harry Palmer, although not Harry Palmer in the stories. Am I right?
In terms of actually the name, yeah.
Yeah. But how did that all begin? How did you decide to take this deep dive into Len Deighton?
Well, I guess I'm a reader and I'm a collector. I read a lot of spy fiction. I read a lot of fiction generally. Watch a lot of movies. I started a website about 11 years ago, just as something to do to test out my web building skills. And it's just started from there. I had the website first, then moved on to Facebook. There's been a sort of Deighton Dossier Facebook page for about, 8 or 9 years or so. It's a small little community, but through it, I've made some interesting global contacts and friends from around the world who either are new to Len Deighton or who read it a lot. One of which is Shane Whaley, host of the SpyHards podcast, and I was on the inaugural episode talking about Len's work. So I'm just a fan and a collector, really. Expert, I'm not sure, but I'll do my best.
Well, I mean, when you began, I'm curious, how big was your knowledge of Len Deighton when you started the blog? And how much has it grown? Like, were you just kind of a casual enthusiast when you dove in, or were you already someone who'd read the books multiple times?
I was a casual enthusiast. The real, if you call it Len Deighton expert, if you will, is a friend of his called Edward Millward Oliver, the chap who wrote the Len Deighton Companion in the 80s. He is Mr. Deighton. He has known him for years. He's rumoured to be writing a sort of biography of him at the moment as well. Me, I'm a sort of an amateur very much in this game. But over the years it's primarily through collecting the books initially I started in. But then the website and through Facebook, a lot of searching online for news clippings and interesting books, ephemera, stuff about the movies. And it's through the website I finally actually managed to get in touch with Len, and from time to time I've had lunch with him and chatted with him as well online. So, and they also never meet your heroes. Not that he's a hero as such, but certainly an author I enjoy. He's actually a really nice chap, and very private, in retirement. But what I do is through the website and through the Facebook page, just it's nice to connect with people who sort of share the same interest, and through that, we chat about the books, collecting the movies, TV stuff. It's quite good fun, really.
And we should note that we are actually recording this episode on his birthday, right?
It is indeed. Mr. Deighton is 92 years old today. That's quite an innings.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm actually quite a big fan of the Deighton Dossier group on Facebook, because unlike the Spyberry bunch, the Deighton Dossier guys haven't put a fatwa up against me just yet. So yeah, they're not hunting me down or calling from my head. So
I won't ask what you did.
I have a home there, which is nice. Well, it was my thoughts on the Ipcris file. That was what it was. Yes.
Well,
the global hunt for Scott began.
I think there is a room for every opinion on any movie, really. So if you don't like it, or if you do like it, the important thing is we have a good discussion.
Well, speaking of the movies, as we seg into today's project, the first three films, the major theatrical motion pictures revolving around Harry Palmer, were you a fan of them? Did you feel they captured the spirit of the books?
I like them. Of the three, my favourite is Funeral in Berlin.
Oh, interesting.
But I think all three have a certain wit and charm to them. They're clearly not as bombastic and as sort of theatrical as the Bond movies or other movies in the era. I mean, particularly I like them because I live and work in London, grew up in London, and London I think is always one of the main actually sort of standout characters in both the books and the movies. So it's actually quite all three movies, but particularly the first two, always give a very good impression of how cool London was in the 60s.
It's nice to know I'm joined by another Londoner. Actually.
Oh, right, okay. Beckenham posse here.
Oh, no.
South London,
no.
yeah.
Yeah, I know where you are. West is best, my friend. West is best.
Well, let's not fall out over this. Sorry, that's a parochial local discussion. But yeah, no, the movies, all three, I like them. And I think I obviously read the books first. I didn't watch them. I watched them, I think, for watch Ipcris File first, then $1 Billion Brain, and then Funeral in Berlin. Yeah, and they're good knockabout stuff, and Caine is the standout feature in all three of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean it is an interesting franchise, and we'll talk about it more in the wider view later in this episode. But it's a journey I very much enjoyed, and just noticing the differences movie to movie to movie, and that continues right into today, right, Scott?
Oh yeah, very much so. Now, I guess that brings us through to what we're doing. So, Cam,
yeah,
what films are we covering this week? Films.
Yes. Yes, we are going to talk about the, I guess, 1995 film Bullet to Beijing and the 1996 film Midnight in St. Petersburg. Two movies shot back to back, aired either straight to video or on TV, depending where you lived, featuring Michael Caine returning to the role of Harry Palmer.
We're going to basically do Bullet to Beijing first, then we're going to talk about the film, and then we're going to move on to Midnight in St. Petersburg, talk about the film, and then wrap up at the end. So, Bullet to Beijing. Now, usually we would do the letterbox.com synopses, but frankly, it's far too long. So we're moving over to imdb.com. Bullet to Beijing. Retired British spy Harry Palmer, Sir Michael Caine, is called back into service by his government to help prevent North Korea from getting its hands on a deadly virus called the Red Death.
Well, that about sums it up there, Scott. I think pretty compactly there.
Yeah, very succinct. I appreciate that. Maybe we should look at IMDb more often on some of these larger ones. But I know this is a TV movie, Cam, but do you have anything about the background on it?
Well, I feel like Rob may be the one to fill in some blanks here, because there is not a lot on the development of this film that I could find. It seems to have really began with exec producer Harry Alan Towers getting the rights to the Harry Palmer character and bringing on a few other producers, notably John Dunning and Andre Link, who produced the 1981 horror classic My Bloody Valentine. And they were like, okay, we've got to reunite the team. So we're bringing in a director, George Mihalka, who directed My Bloody Valentine. They were like, This is it, guys. Our follow-up project. And the director, George Mihalka, is one of those guys where you look at his filmography, it's amazing. It's just a string of B movies and random TV projects. Nothing really of note. There's just one project I want to cite because the title is so amazing, and that is Deceptions 2, Edge of Deception.
I want to know what the third one's called.
I don't know, but the film was written by the exec producer, Harry Alan Towers, under the name Peter Welbeck. And Peter Welbeck, his writing credits are also incredible. A lot of Fu Manchu movies, the Gore franchise, which was like a sword and sorcery knockoff series that I actually watched with my friend. They're terrible, but very funny. He also did some Jack London adaptations, but I recommend anyone who just wants some entertainment for a few minutes, log on to IMDb, go to Harry Alan Towers, writing credentials, and just take in the joy of reading the titles this man has been associated with, because they're really, really fun.
Well, it just sounds like a lot of schlock, really.
Yeah, oh, definitely. It's all schlock, but it's glorious schlock. So this movie, not a lot in terms of the production. It was, I think, shot pretty fast and loose in Russia. But in the 2010 memoir that Michael Caine wrote, he called this the worst professional experience ever, which I think is fascinating for a man who just previously, the year before, had featured in Steven Seagal's directorial debut on Deadly Ground.
Wow.
That is damning.
He'd also done Jaws, is it Jaws 3, I think, as well? So he has form.
Jaws 4.
Jaws 4. He has form in doing the odd terrible movie.
He has the classic quote from Jaws 4 that I know Cam likes to say. So I don't think he's that worried about Jaws 4. But
no, he made a lot of money off Jaws 4. I don't know that he made as much money off this one, but I was really intrigued by the fact him saying this was the worst professional experience ever. Because, I mean, Michael Caine's been in lots of schlock, lots of great stuff, but he was one of those guys who would always just keep working. And you would see him in a movie like The Swarm, for example, where he's battling bees. He would juggle that with like a Woody Allen film, or, showing up in 92, a couple years before this, in Muppet Christmas Carol, where he's so much fun. So he's a guy who I always felt had kind of seen the highs and lows, but apparently this was the low. In terms of the details as to why there was big problems, he cited there was a lot of issues with the mafia in Russia at the time when they were shooting this. The Russian mafia base was the hotel the cast and crew were living in. And so Michael Caine ended up having to have bodyguards at all times. He said they also were using Geiger counters on the food due to lingering effects of Chernobyl. So, yep. But he said the straw that broke the camel's back was he was at Len Film Studios, where they shot much of this movie, and he had to go to the washroom. And so they pointed him in the direction of the bathroom. And he said the toilets were so disgusting, he couldn't even use them. He had to go and urinate against the side of the soundstage.
But Cam, he did this all for the art.
That's right. That's right. And it's weird because, as I, have said, I think off the air, but like these movies were shown internationally straight to video in 95. But like here in North America, where I am, like they didn't show on US TV until August 16th, 1997. So like a couple of years after they were being shown, in the UK and Europe and Japan, places like that. So real bit of a delay there. They were, it seems, at some point considered for theatrical distribution, but that was not the case to be. Although I did find a little nugget that Bullet to Beijing did play in Montreal for a very, very limited run. I have no idea why either. Do you know, Rob?
No, I think that's the case. It was shown in a few Canadian cinemas and apparently some Russian cinemas as well. So, lucky Russians.
Were they lucky?
No, I mean it's rather ironic that Caine and the crew were dealing with the Russian mafia, given that that's sort of one of the themes running through the sort of the plots of both movies. But so it's a case of sort of real life imitating art, or the other way around. I'm not sure, but.
Well, apart from what Cam found out there, Rob, do you have anything about Bullet to Beijing that you know from your vast archives?
Well, I mean, no, in the sense of there is not a lot out there, even on, and if you haven't referenced it before on your other podcasts. There is a website, the Harry Palmer website, run by a Dutchman called Kees Stam. He is, as far as I know, the person who's uncovered the most about these two movies, and it's not a lot. It's in the movie credits and titles. It's portrayed as Len Deighton's Harry Palmer. I've not actually ever asked this of Len directly, but I'm pretty sure he didn't have a huge amount to do it other than probably writing his signature on a sort of contract and saying, yeah, go ahead. He has had some generally in the past some quite challenging experiences with TV producers, so I don't think he suffers fools gladly. So I'm sure it's definitely not something that I don't think Len had a lot of creative input into, indeed any creative input into, which shows.
Yeah, the only thing I could find was that he said basically if they could get Michael Caine back, he'd put his name on it.
Yeah, I think that's broadly it,
which
really.
is amazing.
Without Michael Caine, the movie has nothing to offer. At least with Michael Caine, it has something at least.
And that's not saying much.
So we're already giving a clue to listeners that Bullet to Beijing and its sister film Midnight in St Petersburg are not shining examples of the spy movie genre.
What are you talking about? These are the best TV movies we've covered so far.
Yeah. You see, my point of view is, I watched them both over the last 3 or 4 days just to sort of refresh myself. I've watched them a few times, not many. They are, they're not great. For me, the word that came to my mind is that they have curiosity value. One is seeing Michael Caine or seeing Harry Palmer, if you will, in a sort of down at heel, dressed not in the sort of a sharp sort of 60s suit walking down Soho, but in a sort of anorak walking down some grotty street in St Petersburg. So there's a sort of interesting sort of angle about sort of seeing a sort of familiar character in reduced circumstances. Plus there is also the sort of again, a curiosity value in just seeing sort of the fact that they were filming in Russia fairly soon after the sort of fall of communism is in itself sort of interesting. The fact that the product they came up with is not that great is sort of by the by. So seeing what Russia was like in 1995, and it looks a pretty grubby and sort of down at heel place, has some value. But yeah, if you're expecting lots of action and lots of plot twists and great acting, this isn't your movie. And that's being fair.
I am curious if you have I'm curious if you have any idea, because there are, unadapted Len Deighton, Harry Palmer spy novels like Horse Underwater or whatever. Do you have any idea or like what the thinking was behind why these two movies, Bullet to Beijing and the one we're going to talk about in a few minutes, were entirely original stories?
I don't have any particular insight on there. My suspicion is that, as with a lot of things in the movie business, it was probably money and opportunity involved. Somebody saw an opportunity, with... I imagine that filming in Russia in 1995 was pretty cheap. I imagine that there was probably a gap in Michael Caine's schedule. There was probably Mr. Towers was probably at a loose end, and the fates combined to bring them together in St Petersburg to film these two movies. I suspect there was no more sort of strategic thinking than that.
It makes sense from a financial standpoint. I imagine the amount you have to pay Len Deighton for making the Ipcress file, or Horse Underwater, is far more than an original script lightly touching on his character. Lightly.
Well, they certainly saved money there, yeah. And they saved money on the acting as well.
Take that back about Jason Connery. How dare you? Well, I mean, is there anything else background-wise, gents, or should I lead us in?
No, lead us on in.
Okay, well, we're going to quick fire this. So, thoughts on the film as a whole. Rob, you're our guest. You kind of sort of telegraphed what you think of it already, but Bullet to Beijing, what are your thoughts?
yeah, it's, as I said up front, it's not a great movie, but it's sort of watchable. I didn't, when I sat watching it a couple of evenings ago, I didn't tear my hair out. It has some interesting elements to it. It has, Michael quite a number of sort of English character actors in there, like Michael Gambon as Alex. He does a passable Russian. Jason Connery, he is not a great actor, and he's provides a particularly.
You're trying to be nice.
Well,
you're trying to be nice.
All right, let's be frank. He's as wooden as a cyborg in this movie, but it has the added attraction of the rather attractive Sara, Ferris Bueller's girlfriend, playing the role of Natasha. And even though it's not on the DVD I got, there is a fleeting appearance by Sue Lloyd, the actor who plays Jean in the original Ipcress files. So there are some, for sort of, I guess, Harry Palmer fans, there are some interesting little sort of nods back to the original three movies. There's this sort of suggestion that Jason Connery's character Nikolai is possibly Harry Palmer's sort of illegitimate son. As I say, there's there's the appearance from Jean, his love in the Ipcress file. So and the plot is it's a sort of half chase movie, half sort of heist movie. There's double crossing and triple crossing. There's drugs involved. The Chinese, the North Koreans. It's like somebody's taken all the sort of ingredients from a sort of My First Spy Movie cookbook, thrown them into a pot, but forgot to add some seasoning. That sort of thing. There's all the elements are there, but it doesn't really hang together.
Well, Rob really put the bullet in Beijing. But Cam, what about you?
Okay, so this was one that I kind of dreaded going into because it's like, how good is this going to be when compared against a lot of the film craft that was happening on the first three? But it was a movie that I actually found in some ways a little bit entertaining in terms of reintroducing Harry Palmer into the 90s, because like, what is that like? And where this character's at, being forced into retirement. We see that he's still got kind of that ladies' man kind of vibe we saw in the Ipcress file. He's talking to his girlfriend Sue, who was played by Sue Lloyd in the original, on the phone, which is kind of fun. There's a cut scene that Rob alluded to. It was not in my version, but I'm gonna have to check it out on YouTube. It's in the extended version of the movie, which I didn't get to see. So, but in terms of the movie itself, it was baffling in terms of plotting. I mean, there are, as Rob alluded, so many double and triple crosses that it was like just head spinning at a certain point, trying to make sense of what was going on. I feel like it's the type of movie you want a whiteboard when you're watching it, just to keep track of all the players and the little red vial that's being, that Harry's carrying throughout, and what that means and why it's there and who put it there, and et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of like a spy plot, not great, especially when you compare it to the really, I think, well-honed, convoluted, you could say, story of, say, Funeral in Berlin, which is definitely confusing, but I feel like it does pay off and it all makes sense psychologically and within the world of all these players. Whereas this one, it just felt like they were doing a lot of those crosses for no reason, and with characters who I didn't really even understand who they were, like the CIA guy. And I also noticed this movie had a lot of what I would call Canon Films action, which Canon Films made a lot of, kind of B action movies through the 80s. And this movie had a ton of those moments where it would just cut to like a really kind of cheesy shootout where like a character falls onto an electrical wire, stuff like that. The sort of thing you'd see in like the Death Wish sequels. But overall, like, it was not good, but I found it somewhat watchable. If that makes sense. It's not something I would recommend to anyone, really, unless you are really into the world of Harry Palmer, but I did find it kind of interesting.
I agree. You can spend a reasonable 90 minutes with a sort of cup of tea and a sort of and a snack, and just it's perfectly, as you said, it's watchable. Mm-hmm. I think what you've identified is that, apart from perhaps Harry Palmer, given that he is played by Michael Caine, who even in a bad movie is pretty good, very few of the characters you actually really either understand or care for. But it does have, some, as I say, some sort of strange, almost like funny, unintentionally elements. Like you can tell that basically they had the use, or somebody said, we have an abandoned airport nearby, let's use it. Because at one point, Colonel Gradsky, who's the sort of very a pound store version of Colonel Stock, says, wait a minute, I know somebody in Bratsk. And that sort of, they switched to this airfield where they sort of, after sort of chasing after this train. And it's just bizarre. And it has nothing, it doesn't really advance the plot in any way, but it's just like, I'm sure it's because they had the use of an airfield for a couple of days, you know?
I figured it was either that or because they wanted to work in a North by Northwest homage, because you have them on the train, and then they get out and they get swooped by a plane, and I was like, oh, okay, well, we got a little bit of a Hitchcock nod there.
You have to give the actors their dues. I would not want to be up in the air in the sort of rusty Russian air bucket that they filmed in. I mean, it looked like it was about to fall apart. So, you know, fair dues. But what it does for the plot, I'm not sure. You know, there are parts of it where, you know, it's a heist or a chase movie on a train. So, you know, there's a sort of a certain element of danger, and they both jump out at one point, you know, and there are, you know, there are some sort of modestly good car chases, but, you know, when the cars are Ladas and Moscoviches and they're all rust buckets, it's not like watching the sort of the Fast and the Furious. You know, this is car chases Russian style. You know, and so there's a certain comedy value in that.
I'm going to jump in, I think, at this point on this film. Everyone knows I'm not a big Harry Palmer guy. That's fine. And I came to this film knowing that it had a TV film budget, whatever. And Cam was right. In the beginning, it was quite interesting to see how Harry Palmer was dealing with the 90s. He got shafted once again by the MI5, you know, just chucked out on the street, basically. And he goes to work doing what he does as a private detective again, like he was doing at the beginning of Billion Dollar Brain. This all makes sense. But the problem with this film stems, I think it has the same issue as Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which I'm sure is not a comparison many people have made between these two films. But here we go.
I thought the scene where Michael Caine crawled out of the fridge after the nuclear bomb was a bit much.
It was when they were trying to put Jason Connery over as an action hero and he was swinging from the vines again. It was just all got too much. All got too much. It's just you basically you get a character that's kind of beloved in his own way. So Indiana Jones, and then you put him in a story that's bad, and you surround him with characters that he kind of knows from his past, but aren't very interesting, and you just. At the beginning of the film, you're like, oh, what's going on with Indiana Jones? And by the end, you can't wait for the film to be finished.
There's a lot of scenes of characters like Louis, for example, or the CIA guy, Craig, just like running into him and they're like, oh, hey, Harry, how's it going? And it's like, don't fake that familiarity. I don't know who these people are.
And it's not like they're referencing a character or they even give you a story or reason as to why. It's just like, oh, hey. What do we get from that? That Harry has friends in Russia?
Well, clearly what's missing in these two movies from the first three movies, one of the crucial elements, is what you're missing is the byplay between Harry as a sort of underling, if you will, the sort of lower rank spy, and his superiors. I mean, not least on the Russian side, at least, Colonel Stock. But in terms of, you know, Major Dorby, Colonel Ross, that in the first three movies, or at least the first two, is where the gold lies in terms of the back and forth, the repartee, the dialogue. And they're characters you either sort of you root for or you're turned against. In Bullet to Beijing, you don't get a lot of that. I mean, the most sort of notable sort of, apart from the fact that a lot of the actors are Russian, and clearly nobody will have heard of them. You do get an appearance by Burt Kwouk, lately of the Pink Panther movies, as the outrageously stereotypical Kim Soo, sort of, you know, the ultimate buyer of the Red Death. And his appearance is like you can't get out of your mind the fact that it's Kato. He's not a great actor as it is, but as General Kim Soo, it provides a certain sort of. It made me laugh, frankly. But yeah,
he's an actor though who has presence, and I think that's something that's kind of missing. Like uh, with the Harry Palmer films, the previous ones, like I always liked how you'd have Colonel Stock would come back, or Ross, or Dolby only gets the one movie, but he's very memorable. Like they are very fun personalities to watch Harry Palmer bump up against. And I feel like Burt Kwouk actually brings that. Like he actually has that sort of personality, even if the character's not really there on paper and it's pretty stereotypical. I wanted more of that because a lot of the characters, regardless of the talent of the people, portraying these characters, you look at like, Jason Connery as Nick, or Mia Sara, who you referenced, as Natasha. Like, I have nothing against these two actors. I've seen, both of them be fun in other things, but they are not good in this movie. Like, they're playing very one note, kind of forgettable characters. Like Mia Sara's character is a real blank. Like she barely talks.
well, she's given nothing to. She's given hardly anything to say. I think that's one of the challenges. Is that it's, as I say, it all reflects the fact that this is a movie that either it was produced at sort of either breakneck speed, or the budget didn't stretch to allowing more time to develop the characters, or all these sort of things. It sort of it has a sort of certain pound shop quality to it.
I mean, we're on Mia Sara, so I'll just jump on this bit whilst I have a chance. But did they have to write a scene where she's about to have sex with Michael Caine? And I will point out that Michael Caine was 62 at the point of filming this film, and Mia was early 30s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, it is incredibly uncomfortable intentionally.
Well, it nails that. It's probably the only thing in this film that nails what it starts out to do. Like, that's not great. And then, and let's not beat around the bush. To me, this feels like let's make it out like Jason Connery is Harry Palmer's son.
Yeah.
And let's try and build the world for him to take over with his own films.
I guess. Although it kind of feels like, you referenced the Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, where it's like, here's Mutt Williams. Guys, can't you wait to see like his movies? And it's like, we're good. Like the idea of Jason Connery spin-offs was not something that really ever crossed my mind watching these, to be fair. But the idea of that is brutal. Scott, I fear for the nightmare you were living in, thinking you might have to watch Jason Connery films.
Hey, we've got another film of him in just a few minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the only other problem I have with this film at sort of a nitpicky level is Michael Gambon's accent.
Oh, okay.
Honestly, you notoriously are bad with accents.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
He is dropping in and out of a British accent every sentence. I'm waiting for him to tell me that Harry Potter is a wizard, and then just to segue back into something about plutonium.
He's like, Harry, and Palmer's like, yes. I would love to see Harry Palmer play Quidditch.
I was going to say one again is we are sort of clutching at straws a little here, but one of the sort of semi-interesting aspects of the film, indeed the other film we're going to discuss in a second, is the soundtrack. For prog rock fans to find that sort of, Rick Wakeman, keyboard player of Yes, it's a sort of interesting choice. But then again, when it's rather like the films, when you compare it with what went before, with the sort of stirring John Barry soundtrack to Ipcrest, the sort of Germanic sort of Sturm und Drang of Konrad Elfer's in Funeral in Berlin. It doesn't quite work, although it's not too bad. It's a little repetitive, but it adds a certain sort of level of it's quite sort of atmospheric. But I was more sort of surprised to find that Rick Wakeman, I haven't heard from him for a long time. But like you say, we are clutching at straws here.
I'm glad you mentioned the soundtrack, because I wrote down a quick note about it, and I agree, it is very repetitive. But I just felt like it was such a melodramatic sounding soundtrack.
It's very, very like 80s straight to video. That's what it felt like to me. And this is the 90s, so that's kind of damning. But it totally has that sound you would expect to see. If you saw a parody of like 1980s straight to video action movies, you would see a score or hear a score like this being played over the action, because It is. I mean, I may work clips of it into the actual episode of this podcast, I think, just for fun, because it's like really crazy. I here's the thing, like, it is a radical departure, and that's one thing we've seen in the Harry Palmer films, is that they change up the score quite drastically movie to movie. So I can admire a franchise for doing that, kind of the way that the early Mission Impossible switched up their directors every movie until they got to part 5. And I always kind of like the shift in style. I like the idea of shifting the style of the music for Harry Palmer, but I mean, look, Rick Wakeman is working with a lot of limitations. I don't think there was a lot of money being thrown his way to get maybe an orchestra or really outside of anything beyond a Casio keyboard. So I'm sure he did the best he could, but the limitations are very, very laid bare.
I want to move us on to the next film. So, has anyone got any like final points on this film?
Well, I would just love to know from the two of you, did you find the plot beyond convoluted to follow?
It was all over the place, and I'm used to, like you mentioned earlier, the funeral in Berlin. You know, it is crazy, and it's, you know, double, triple twists, but it does earn it, and it does lay the groundwork for it. This film just flips around because it's a spy film.
Yeah. What about you, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dish the movie just for the sake. It's not a great movie. It has moments. The main thing for me is with the plot. By the end of it, I don't really care who got the drugs, who got the weapons. It's sort of it drags a bit towards the end. Although there's a sort of semi-interesting sort of firefight at the end of it in a very sort of muddy Russian station car park. But by that point, you really don't care. and a good movie should make you care and really want to know what's happening right up to the last minute.
Yeah, I mean, I did kind of appreciate the muddy locations. That's one thing I liked about the Harry Palmers, was they would often be kind of gritty. I like that. But yeah, in terms of this whole plot, I don't think there's anything wrong with the concept of this was it the Red Scare, the plague going to be spawned by these chemicals. I wondered if the mixing chemicals thing was some sort of it's interesting that Die Hard with a Vengeance comes out the same year as this movie, and that's all about mixing chemicals for explosives. I think this one had some fun with that. I don't have a problem with that. It's just in terms of this whole Russian nesting doll that Harry's carrying around, and the character of Michael Gambon's character, Alex. I could not even follow how many steps ahead this man would have to be to get to where he was by the end. And Michael Gambon, great actor, but he's literally phoning this performance in sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a workable concept in search of a decent script and a good director.
Definitely.
It just sounds like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull all over again. But the other note I had was there was that very strange voiceover at the end between Harry and Nick, where they set up the name of the company that they're going to work for in the next film, which I thought that was just like a added on last minute thing. I just found that a bit weird.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. That was really strange, that credit sequence of, just like voiceover. I would have to assume that was an entire scene that they just decided to cut and just played the audio over the credits. It was really weird.
I agree.
Not to mention the actual company name. I did have a question for Rob before we move on. Is the Tight Fit T-shirt company, is that actually a Deighton reference?
Isn't it the Fitsall, or is that the one in the next movie?
They call it Fitsall, but in this they call it Tight Fits in the voiceover at the end of the film.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I'm not aware of what, apart from a terrible pun. I'm not aware of what there's no sort of obvious link there. I think certainly not to the other movies. I'm not aware of.
Well, that's a shame. It's not funny, and it's actually not connected to anything either. Okay, well. Quick fire round. Is Bullet to Beijing making the NOC list? Rob?
Sadly, no.
Cam?
No, I mean, this is a movie that it just doesn't have any of the ambition of the others. It feels very bottom drawer compared in terms of the storytelling and filmmaking. So no, not a chance.
That's 2 no's, and for me, it's also a no. You've got Michael Caine. I feel like trying a little bit to be Harry Palmer. It's nice to see him playing the character that we've all grown fond of, but there's nothing to gain from this film.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that brings us over to Midnight in St. Petersburg. Let me read the quick synopsis for that. Midnight in St. Petersburg. Harry Palmer heads a private investigation business based in Moscow. His associates are Nikolai Nick Petrov, ex-CIA agent Craig, and ex-KGB Colonel Gradsky. They take on the job of finding 100 grams of weapons-grade plutonium stolen from the Russian government, though they don't know the identity of the client.
Hmm.
Dum dum dum. Well, these films were done back to back, but Cam, do you have anything different on this one?
Not really. This one has a different director. His name's Douglas Jackson. He was actually an Oscar nominee for Best Short Subject in the live action category at the 1970 Oscars for a movie called Blake. He did a short subject. He is a documentarian. He also worked in TV a lot and a ton of B movies and TV movies over the course of his career. We have the same writer, the exec producer, Harry Allen Towers, overseeing this, but um, I could find little nuggets, and maybe Rob can confirm this, but the idea was like Bullet to Beijing would be sort of the major movie, and then this was sort of the quickie one they also shot as well. But the whole idea was that Bullet to Beijing was going to be the one that would get a theatrical, and this one maybe more so just entirely directed towards TV. I'm not completely sure.
That's broadly correct. My understanding is that it's. I mean, what we forgot to mention in both the first film and this one is it's a Canadian Russian movie, which is a very rare combination. This movie, Midnight in St. Petersburg, I believe was the backers were Showtime Network, which is one of the growing. This was at an era when cable TV in North America was growing apace. And I think this was their sort of, I guess the idea was that if the movie did well, they'd have something else to show on their cable network. So it's, like I say, and there is a suggestion, I read in a couple of books, there's a suggestion that basically this was made out of all the sort of stuff that was on the cutting room floor. I don't think it's quite as sort of simple as that, but clearly they were made not just back to back, but probably made at the same time, because there's a lot of I think one or two of the extras look familiar. There's clearly some of the same sort of broad group of actors from the first film, the same locations. So it has all the hallmarks of a sort of something that the accountants on the film recommended.
Yeah,
it certainly uses some of the same sets as well, like you say, Rob. Like the bar is definitely the same bar in both films.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of crossover.
Probably the same dancers, you know.
Oh, probably, yeah. And this movie, in terms of its release, showed up on home video as like the other one, UK, Europe, Japan, in '96, and then showed on TV in North America in 1998. So definitely delayed there again. But that's really about it in terms of the behind the scenes. Just that this was kind of the minor production tacked onto the other one, and I think that's very telling when you look at the runtime. The first one's like an hour 40, and this one's like 125 or something.
Thankfully,
as listeners will understand, we're not talking about two Oscar-winning movies here, but of the two, I actually preferred Midnight in St. Petersburg.
Really? Because
essentially, what the producers have done is remade essentially the same film, because it's a sort of another sort of a shot in the same location, broadly the same cast. There's another spy cliche. This time it's plutonium rather than a sort of bio weapon. But essentially, somebody's stealing it. Somebody's setting up a deal, and there's going to be a shootout. So of the two variations of that cliche, I sort of I thought this was the slightly better movie.
Oh,
it's not saying much, but it's slightly better.
Interesting.
That's fascinating. I mean, I'm not going to hide what I feel about this film. If no one has any background, I'll just jump right into our thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. This film feels like exactly how I've read about it. It is the offcuts. It is that second Anchorman film, not the actual Anchorman 2, but the one that came with the DVD that's like an hour and a half of off clippings from the film that they just sort of pieced together with voiceover work.
Oh, right.
I forget what it's called. And I genuinely struggled because this one felt even less like it was to do with Harry Palmer and more to do with well, their fits-all agency, and by extension, Jason Connery's character of Nick. I couldn't give a monkeys.
I also really honed in on the fact, like, you could tell that this one was the bargain basement of the two, because just in terms of the plotting, it's incredibly basic. Where you have this kidnapping of Nick's girlfriend Tatiana, and then also the plutonium. It's just like I could figure out how these two things were linked almost immediately. And the movie didn't try to pull the rug out from me like the previous one. It really felt like with Bullet to Beijing, they were at least trying to make a really heavily encrypted spy film. Whereas this one, they were just like, we got these actors. What's the MacGuffin? Plutonium sounds good. Let's just run with that. And I can kind of see where Rob's coming from, though, in terms of just like, it's breezy. It's 90 minutes. You kind of get to like live in this world a little more. And I did kind of enjoy, because these movies were shot back to back, you have all the same supporting characters popping up throughout. And I just appreciated getting to revel in sort of the Harry Palmer world a little bit. Just, because a lot of the other movies, they would just drop characters movie to movie. And in here, we had them all back. Luis is back. The Russian mafia dude, the CIA agent, they're all back. And I kind of enjoyed that aspect. But in terms of the plotting, I mean, by the time they wound up at that rickety-looking film studio, which I couldn't help but wonder if that was the film studio Michael Caine was complaining about the toilets in. I
suspect it was.
No doubt.
I think it was. Yeah. That was where I just was like, okay, we're really in the dregs here, people.
That's quite meta at that point, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I don't disagree with any of the points any of the raised. Like I say, when I say it says I preferred the film, it's only marginally better, and it's a sort of very thin margin. But I think there's a couple of things. As I say, it's a remake almost of the same movie. It has its moments, and Harry Palmer is still Harry Palmer. But I think in this film, he's even more sort of he looks even more out of shape and dishevelled than in the first movie, and he's. If you remember, think back to the sort of first three films, how stylish the original character was, or the character was originally. In this second movie, he wears a particularly terrible anorak, which no leading man should ever wear an anorak in a movie.
I don't even know what an anorak is, to be fair.
I don't know what they call him in North America. Cagoule, sort of.
And you call yourself a co-host of a spy podcast.
You know
what
right?
anorak is.
So embarrassing. I'm so embarrassed. I'm crawling under my desk right now.
The big coats that they always wear, like what the Fox Mulder has on over his suit.
Oh, a trench coat?
Sure.
Okay.
Like by extension, yeah, kind of that, but yeah, that'll do.
Okay. I'm not a stylish fellow. It should be fair.
Can confirm.
Neither is Harry Palmer in this movie. So, I mean, there are a couple of sort of things I noted down that made me actually laugh. And I guess in a sort of serious movie, that's probably not a good sign. But, there were two things I noted down. One of which is very early in the movie. There is a new hero on the screen, which is a dog.
Yes.
Harry, in the first early scenes, Harry Palmer receives what looks like a very unthreatening letter, which they run a Geiger counter on, realises some sort of bomb. Go figure. Throws it out the window. It's picked up by a dog, who then takes it down a dark alley. 2 seconds later, there's a huge explosion. As an audience, you would think, oh my God, the poor dog is dead. And then 3 seconds later, the dog emerges unscathed. It's unintentionally funny, but that was sort of a bit of levity in a sort of otherwise quite down movie. And the other thing I enjoyed about this movie, and such I wrote it down to bring to this discussion, is it's one of the sort of, again, unintentionally funny, but also quite memorable lines of dialogue I've ever listened in a movie, which is when Harry is lifted on the streets by a couple of thugs and thrown into the back of a Zill limousine. And I think it's Yuri is in the back of the limousine, and he says the immortal line, "Don't squash my bananas." Now that in itself is worth watching the movie for, because to hear the great Sir Michael Caine as Harry Palmer say, "Don't squash my bananas," is, I wrote it down. It was worth writing down, I think.
Yeah, well, like throughout both of these movies, he throws a lot of like, "Oh bloody hell," and that sort of thing. But to hear him actually say a line like that made me laugh. As for the dog scene, I believe me, I laughed too at that dog scene. I thought it was hilarious, but and not for necessarily the right reasons. But I did wonder, in the world of Harry Palmer, which is a more cynical world than say the Bond, franchise. I feel like the dog should have blown up. Not that I'm, not that I want to be the guy. This is the hill I'm going to die on, is killing animals on screen. But to me, that seems more like the pessimistic worldview of Harry Palmer, that something like this would happen.
And then you get the sort of like, oh, he had a rough day.
Sure. Yes, Scott. Yes. But yeah, like I just feel like in a lot of the more Hollywood films, of course, the dog is going to survive. But in a Harry Palmer world, I feel like it is that sort of downbeat, nothing really good ever happens kind of world. So it kind of made sense to me when it happened. And then when they chickened out on it, I said, oh, okay, well, fair enough, I guess.
It's worth noting is the dog gives one of the better performances.
Truth.
It's very true. One interesting thing I noted down, well, two things I've got noted down. Firstly, is this one feels kind of like a buddy cop story with Harry and Nick.
Yeah, I kind of like that. I'm not going to say they've got good dialogue because they sure don't, but the two of them seem to like each other. Like there's a little bit of a breezy chemistry there. It's not exactly the stuff of legends. It's not Riggs and Murtaugh in Lethal Weapon or something, but it was pleasant enough that I wished we got more of it, because they did separate them at a certain point, and I think the movie suffers for that a bit.
Yeah, I would like to have seen a bit more of that. I do not want to see the Jason Connery spin-off, but having them together on screen with Michael Caine playing the boss and Nick going out and doing some missions, I could have maybe watch that maybe.
Sure. And you got the team there too, the CIA guy Craig and the Russian guy. I think you've got something.
Yeah. And the only other thing I noticed, and this really does sort of bring it home, that this is the direct to VHS DVD spin-off film, the last bit, the dregs that they've sort of brought together, is it hasn't even got Mia Sara in it.
No, well, you've got Tatiana in this one, right? So I guess that's the female lead being brought over for this one.
But like, she was main cast in the first one, and she just disappears, no mention.
I was just going to say, the other sort of interesting, in inverted commas, female character in this second movie is this journalist Brandy. I don't know if that's Brandy with an I or Brandy with a Y, but again, it's an interesting spy movie cliche. This sort of interesting journalist, he's got the ear to the ground. But what her character is not particularly well developed, and I think what really brought it home to me, quite how sort of little thought they gave to her character. She eventually, without spoiling anything, she eventually betrays Harry Palmer. Is when she's tasked with getting Harry Palmer to sort of meet up. This is why the midnight at St Petersburg comes in. The deal for the plutonium is going down by Friday midnight. She's charged with getting Harry Palmer to the location to effectively be shot or killed, at least. Her method is there's armed guards at the front of this, or private security guards at the front of this movie theatre. The film studios. And her solution is she looks at Harry Palmer and flashes the press. She says, here's the answer. She has a press badge. They drive up to the gate with the armed guard. She flashes her press card credentials. Great, yeah. He opens it up straight away. No questions asked. That struck me as the most preposterous part of the film. But it's just another example of where, I suppose, with a little bit of thought and attention, that sort of type of character could have, there's something there. Journalists are always sort of interesting characters to portray and play, but they gave all of 3 minutes thought with that character, I think.
Well, here's a notion, and maybe this is where our problems of the film comes from, apart from every other problem, is that we expect more from a Harry Palmer story, but this is so base level, not a lot of thought put into it, that we're not only bored by it, but we're just disappointed.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a degree to which, I think, extending your point, you could, there's a case to be made for saying, does it actually almost like slightly besmirch the sort of reputation of the character? I don't think so in the end, because most people haven't seen this, but it's rather like sort of I don't know, growing up having a favourite uncle, and then when you're an adult going to see him and he's sort of dishevelled, living in a hovel with a sort of sort of cooking on a one-ring stove. It's sort of it's disappointing and rather slightly sad.
Stop describing our futures here.
Yeah. Future. Rob's describing my apartment right now.
That's why you turn the camera off. That makes sense now.
The shame. I wanted to touch on Brandy for a second, the reporter character, which is one of my favorite cliches, especially in this era. I wonder if this is the Ninja Turtles effect, but you have this journalist that runs around, and we never see them actually doing any work whatsoever. They're never taking notes. They're never pulling out tape recorders, but they just keep running around saying, I got to get a story. It's like, okay. Like, what is this woman's beat?
It would only be less cliched if she wore a trilby hat with the word press tucked into the ribbon band.
Oh my God, I would have loved that. That would have been amazing. Yeah, it just kind of made me laugh. And the fact that she is evil in the end, it's like, okay, I guess. I was going to say, though, as to maybe why Sara wasn't brought back, I don't know if they would have been able to afford her, quite honestly, because I think the two actresses who show up in the second part, Tanya Jackson and Michelle Burke, I don't think they would be as expensive as a Sara would be. So that was probably just it.
I could probably guarantee that.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Any final thoughts on the film? I haven't got anything myself.
I have one major one. There is no climax to this movie. We get to the scene in the movie studios. Basically, they all duck out the back door, and then it cuts to them at the bar being like, well, everyone was arrested. And I'm like, what?
Exactly. It's not a thrilling ending.
I found myself just scratching my beard, as just confused as to how we got to that point, because I admit at that point I was already a bit wasn't enjoying the film, wasn't that invested, and then they've got this sort of tense moment, and then we're in the bar drinking vodka. I just thought, did I fall asleep again, like the Bourne Legacy? I didn't.
Yeah, it felt like the ending of a TV show where they're all like, okay, everyone involved was arrested. And it's like, what? Like, even the Michael Gambon character who we've been following for 2 movies, this character doesn't get any sort of ending. We just get him slamming a phone down. It felt like the sort of thing where you go, everyone's arrested. And then the next week, Alex could be out on bail causing trouble all over again.
Very Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. There's a good line, I think, that kind of sums up this movie, though, where they're at the circus. And Michael Caine says, the spy game's a lot like the circus. Nothing is what it seems, and it's usually worse.
You should have led this whole episode with that.
I know, right? Oh, well.
I will point out this film has probably one of the most budget-looking casinos I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
Anyone pick up on that? That was bad.
It was,
Yeah, it's just so weird to see Michael Caine in a film like this. If you can call it a film.
Yeah. You can really see the downgrade in terms of just the money to be spent on the first one versus the second. So, you could tell they loved their travelogue shots, though, because the entire credits were played out over these loving shots of Russian scenery. So those are kind of nice.
It's cheap.
Yep, it was.
Well, that's it for me. Cam?
I think that sums me up as well for Midnight in St. Petersburg.
Rob?
Yeah, I have nothing else to add other than it's been an enjoyable discussion about 2 not so enjoyable but sort of interesting movies.
Well, let's wrap it up and pivot into something slightly more interesting. Midnight in St. Petersburg, NOC List. Rob?
No.
Easy enough, Cam?
Yet.
No. It doesn't need to be any more complex than that. It was going to be a bit of an ask that any of these films made it when we said no to Funeral in Berlin or to $1 Billion Brain. But, as such, the dossier on Bullet to Beijing and Midnight in St. Petersburg are closed, and neither of them are making the NOC List. But before we wrap up the episode, this is the second of our franchises that have come to a close so far. So I think we've got the Len Deighton expert with us. I want to take a minute to sort of look back at these 5 films, if we call them the last 2 films, and just really take a minute to think about our thoughts on the films altogether. So, Cam, why don't you lead us off?
Well, I just want to know from Rob, when he looks at this collection of 5 films, does the Harry Palmer franchise feel like one that they figured out? Like, where did it kind of go wrong, do you think?
Well, it probably had the potential for maybe one or one more. I mean, certainly they never filmed, although there was some sort of early sort of discussions about it. They never filmed Horse Underwater, which, given it's got submarines and and heroin and sort of beautiful scenery in Portugal, it had the potential to be a good movie. I think maybe that with the 3 films, let's consider the 3 films as a sort of group.
Mm-hmm.
Over a period of a few years, I think I like all 3 of them. Indeed, I like Billion Dollar Brain. Certainly, I think Funeral in Berlin is the best of the 3 from my view. I think probably they just ran out of steam a little bit because I think they're so tied up, and the Harry Palmer character is so centrally linked to Michael Caine, that had there been scope for filming one of the other, something like An Expensive Place to Die, perhaps, one of the other novels ostensibly featuring the same unnamed spy, if Michael Caine wasn't on board, as I say, I think it's very difficult for the viewing public, I guess, to sort of perhaps maybe to connect with a new version of Harry Palmer. Of course, they've done it with Bond in a sense. With there now, I think 6, isn't it, or 6 or 7 different Bond actors.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether that would have been the case if there had been further Harry Palmer movies.
Well, here's a question: was James Bond in many ways the enemy to a Harry Palmer franchise? Because Harry Saltzman obviously launches the Ipcress file and produces the first 3, but when you look at like a lot of the spy movies that are popular in the 60s, it's stuff like the Flint movies, the Matt Helm films, things that are taking the more fun, escapist elements of James Bond. And it feels like the public was really latching onto those. When I look at the Ipcress file, a movie I really loved, I thought the Ipcress file was fantastic. I liked Funeral in Berlin a lot. I wasn't as big on Billion Dollar Brain, but nonetheless, like, they have a very specific vibe that I really enjoy. And I'm just wondering, like, if Harry Palmer was almost that franchise, it would have been maybe a little more successful had it maybe started in the 70s, which was more of an era for that sort of, gritty spy storytelling.
It's a fair point for discussion, I think. These are all hypotheticals. Who knows what if Harry Saltzman had more, perhaps more funding for a 4th movie? Who knows? But I mean, one observation I've always had is I think it's very difficult to think about the character of Harry Palmer, but also to think about the movies and the books outside of the era in which they were written, the 60s. I think for me and I think in a good way, they're very tied to that era. And I think the character of Harry Palmer, in terms of his mannerisms, his sort of what would now be termed problematic approach to women, is very 60s, and it fits that era, and the age at which Michael Caine was when he was playing the character sort of fits. It all sort of comes together in a sort of intense period, sort of 2 to 3 years of filmmaking, where the character exploded. And maybe, as I say, there's a degree to which, as these 2 movies we've discussed shows, is maybe everything has a lifespan.
Well, I mean, it's interesting though, because they are making a Ipcress file reboot. Like, they are bringing the Ipcress file back to TV. Yeah. And I'll be very curious to see if it's a period piece or if they just try to update it entirely. But I do think, I mean, there's a lot of wealth of material in Len Deighton's novels, as well, to the character of Harry Palmer, or the unnamed protagonist in the novels. It feels like there's a lot there. It just hasn't quite maybe struck the way it should.
Well, you're absolutely correct. They're currently filming now in Liverpool, in England, is one of the locations which is doubling for London, essentially, I guess, in the new Ipcress file movie being produced for ITV, which is the main commercial channel in the UK. It is being filmed in a period, so it is being set in the 60s. They're not seeking to update it or make it, bring it up to date in that sense. I'm optimistic. I think it's going to be the key thing with any sort of readapt or adaptation of an existing movie or genre or series is I think you've got to go into it with an open mind. Clearly, Michael Caine is not playing Harry Palmer in the TV series. It's a young actor who's been on Peaky Blinders. He looks about 16, but he's apparently 32. If he gives a good performance, if he gets the right director, if he can make it his own. I mean, he's still wearing glasses, which is, if that wasn't the case, I would probably not watch it. There's a key. But, he's got opportunities to carve his name out. A lot of the sort of audience that they will be pitching the TV series to probably hasn't heard of or watched a Harry Palmer movie. So if they can get it right, if they can get the glamour of the 60s, if they can get the sort of the Cockney accents, the class element to it, if they can get it sufficiently glamorous enough that it has international appeal, because I'm sure, in this era of streaming, there will certainly be an international market for a sort of a period spy drama, which I guess is what it will become now. I'm reasonably optimistic. They say never go back, but perhaps it's a case of not going back, but going in a different way to the same, or a different direction from the same starting point. Because they're going to have, I think, about 6 one-hour episodes, something like that, which obviously gives them much more time for character development, for some of the sort of the snappier dialogue and some of the sort of office sort of the elements of sort of bureaucracy and sort of office relationships that particularly with Harry and Jean, they were actually sort of really important in the first movie. So I'm optimistic.
I'm quite looking forward to it, actually. As someone who wasn't a big fan of the Ipcress file, maybe that's a bit of a strange thing to admit, but I just there's this section of the James Bond community, which I know is a different franchise, that are really calling for James Bond to go back to the sort of 50s and 60s where Ian Fleming based his books. And just that vibe of the time, the fun factor, everything's so grim dark now with a lot of media, and James Bond films are one of those. So I'm quite interested to see what it does going back to it. I certainly would not have wanted them to try and update the Ipcress file for now. I think that would have been a disaster. And I think having 6 one-hour movies, television has changed now. It's far more cinematic. I think they really could knock it out of the park. And I think some of my problems with Ipcress file was actually more to do with like cinematography, things like that, as a part, not like Michael Caine's choices. I really liked his portrayal of Harry, so I'm hoping they managed to keep that going in this one.
Well, I'm actually curious. This is a question for Rob, because I think he's the person to answer this one. Mm-hmm. When we look at James Bond, what the general audience considers to be James Bond, a lot of that comes obviously from Sean Connery, and then the people that inherited the crown after, Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan, Daniel Craig. How much, based on both the movies and the books, how much of the personality of the Harry Palmer character is derived from the films and like Michael Keaton's performance versus the novels?
I think of the 3 films, certainly the Caine's performance is pretty close. I mean, it's not exact, but it's pretty close to the unnamed spy as is portrayed in the books. I mean, there's a couple of obvious things where in the film, in the books rather, the unnamed spy is from Burnley, which is in the north of England, rather than Michael Caine, who's the most Cockney of Cockneys. And for those of you international listeners, a Cockney is somebody from sort of the rougher parts of London. Let's put it that way. But I think what does come across in both in the film, it's very sort of, I think, central to what's in the movies, is the sense in which you have a class of the old guard, the bureaucrats, the high ups in WOOCP. And given that this was happening in the 60s, the era of the Beatles and flower power, women's lib, etc., you have the interesting sort of juxtaposition of that sort of ex-colonial sort of administrator era, a class of people, and sort of young upstarts, of which the unnamed spy as Harry Palmer as he became is a great example. So I think it's pretty close, and hopefully, like you say, I think in this new TV series, I'm hopeful that a lot of that sort of sparkiness, the sort of spunkiness of the 60s, in the fashions, the sort of lighting, the cars, all those sort of elements. I think hopefully, I'm quite confident that it has all. I mean, the key thing is the book, and that's why I guess the film was successful. The book, it's quite complicated, but it has a lot in there, and I think there's a lot in between the lines in terms of the dialogue, the characters, the characterizations, the sort of relationships. If they can bring that across in the TV series, I think they should have a hit, I imagine.
I'll ask you a quick question, Rob, just to sort of slowly wrap us up.
Yeah.
Do you think that, I mean, me and Cam are also Star Trek fans, apart from sort of spy movies. And for a very long time, Star Trek fans were sort of long suffering. There was no more Star Trek. It was basically a dead property. And now it's been revived somewhat. There's questions there, but we won't get into it. If the ITV show hadn't have been pitched and it never happened, would you have been happy with how Len's work had been brought to the screen with these 5 films?
In terms of this particular character, yeah, I think on the whole, I like them. I think a lot of people like them. They're not everyone's cup of tea, but I think Harry Palmer is a useful addition to the canon in terms of spy fiction as portrayed in the movies and on TV. In terms of actually Len's body of work overall, the key thing for me is, we're still waiting 6 years after it was announced, is if they do eventually get off the ground the TV adaptation of Game, Set and Match, for which the company Clerkenwell Films are still holding the rights but has done absolutely nothing with them. If they can get that right, because I think of the 2 spies central to Len Deighton's oeuvre, his body of work over sort of 50 years, I think Bernard Sampson is the stronger character and the stronger sort of spy archetype. And if they can get that right, build on the sort of mixed legacy of the 1988 TV series, which has never been released commercially, and that's for another discussion perhaps. But if they can get that right, then I think, as a writer and as a sort of creator, I think that would be a great body of work to represent the books that we've enjoyed.
Okay, I've got one more question. Cam, have you got any?
No, go ahead, Scott.
Last question then. If you were to recommend one Harry Palmer film and one Len Deighton book to new people, new to sort of spy films or new to Len Deighton's work, what ones would you go for? I know obviously Funeral in Berlin is your favourite of the films, but we're looking at more from an entry viewpoint because a lot of our listeners might not have seen any of these films at this stage.
Start at the beginning. I think The Ipcress File absolutely is a great movie. And I think as an introduction to the character, as an introduction to the style of the movie and the characters and the sort of genre, it's a great start. In terms of books, I would point either new readers in the direction of Berlin Game, because for me, I think that's the start of a 10-book odyssey with one of the great sort of spy fiction characters in Bernard Sampson. So those would be my 2 recommendations.
Very nice, very nice. Now, Scott, I have a question for you.
Oh.
Now that we've wrapped up Harry Palmer, and I think it's been a really fun journey, and when I picked this franchise, I didn't realize kind of how interesting a journey it would be. I had heard of the Ipcress File, but I didn't really know anything beyond that. And I think it's been really interesting podcasting, just going over these films because they are so different from one another, with the exclusion of the last 2 that we covered in this episode. But how do you rank these films now that we've kind of wrapped up Harry Palmer?
Wow, okay. Do you want to go from worst to best?
Sure.
Okay. It's almost diminishing returns for me. I would say it's probably last place, Midnight in St. Petersburg. Very quickly followed up with Bullet to Beijing. I would then put in third place $1 Billion Brain. Second place, and this is where the people come after me, is I would still put Ipcress File.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only one of our films that made the NOC list out of the 5 films. But for me, I found Funeral in Berlin slightly more interesting and more approachable for me.
Right.
What about you, Cam?
For me, it's the diminishing returns. It literally runs, 5-1. Like there's no bouncing around the way there was with Men in Black. To me, the weakest is Midnight in St. Petersburg, and we go right backwards to the Ipcris File being my favorite of the group at number 1.
I mean, there is a reason that I have the Ipcris File on Blu-ray. It is a fantastic film. There's bits of it I didn't like, but I can still appreciate the art. I don't think there's a very good Blu-ray release of Funeral in Berlin.
There is a Blu-ray here in North America, I believe. I don't own it, but it is. I believe we do have one.
Okay. How would you rank them, Rob? Are you closer to me or closer to Cam?
Probably closer to Cam, I think.
Okay. Well, I think that about wraps up our Harry Palmer, Bullet to Beijing, Midnight in St. Petersburg, triple bill, basically, of discussion. But I really want to thank you, Rob, for coming on the show. Clearly more educated than both of us combined, especially about Deighton, but just in general. So, genuinely, thank you for joining us.
That's very kind of you, gentlemen. It's been a blast. And
where can the listeners find more from yourself?
Well, the website I've run for 10 years is DeightonDossier.net. And if you're on Facebook and Twitter, just do a quick search under that title, and you'll find me and a small community of other spy fiction fans.
And I would really recommend anyone who's enjoyed discovering the Ipcris File, perhaps through this podcast, or wants to take the dive into Deighton's work, follow along with the Deighton Dossier, because I think it'll really inform your journey. And there's a lot of just fun little nuggets of information there that will enrich the whole experience.
I mean, I certainly used it for my research for this film and the previous ones. So it's the go-to for Deighton. So I tip my hat to you, Rob.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Now, before we talk about what we're doing next week, I want to throw to a quick message from the Infectious Groove podcast. Here you go.
Looking for a new podcast? Check out the Infectious Groove podcast. My name is Russ, and I host the show along with Michelle and Kyle. Every Monday, the three of us bring you music news and tell you our jammy jams, so you'll always have new music to check out. The Infectious Groove podcast discusses music from nearly every decade and genre while openly displaying our passion for music you need to hear. On top of that, we have a thought-provoking main topic of discussion every week to get you thinking, discussing, and sharing music. We also include interviews with the music stars of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms. Subscribe and listen to the Infectious Groove podcast on your favorite podcast platform today.
That's right. That's the Infectious Groove podcast. They have some really great episodes out there. They also have a great YouTube channel as well. They do a lot with vinyls and things like that. So check them out. Infectious Groove. Cam, what are we doing next week?
Well, Scott, we are going to be tackling Tenet, Christopher Nolan's 2020 blockbuster. Some interesting baggage attached to that movie, and I'm looking forward to talking through this very confusing movie with you.
Sorry, Cam, I can't quite hear you. There's this really loud music playing in my ears.
Yeah, I know. I need to just have muffled dialogue throughout that entire part, right?
What are you talking about? That's how you sound all the time.
That's true.
That's right. So your mission, listeners, should you choose to accept it, is to check out Tenet if you haven't already and join us next week. And you can, of course, follow us discreetly at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, don't break the law.